Hi there everyone! Welcome to this week's video where we're going to be discussing Simone de Beauvoir and Leslie Feinberg on the topic of gender freedom. This week is really exciting because we're discussing what's really become a hot button, really, tense, I think, political discussion in recent years. Just to give you some context, I do research on the nature of gender, and I also am working on a certificate for the Women Gender Sexuality program over at UNM. So I also have taught classes like Introduction to Gender Studies. These classes, which at an institution like UNM has existed for many, many years, has recently become, very, very politically controversial to the point where various classes on critical race studies as well as gender studies have been canceled, especially in places like Florida, where the state is threatening to withhold funding from the university if such classes continue to be taught. So what we're going to do today is not really settle any issue on like what you should think about gender or something like that. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at two figures, two philosophers, and see how their gender ideas figure into their conception of freedom. And of course, my aim is not to convince you to proselytize any particular philosopher. As always, we are examining these philosophers only insofar as we find their ideas useful for us to do ethics today. But nevertheless, these are two figures that have been particularly influential in the philosophy of gender and sex, and so they are going to be the central topics of our conversation today. Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, is quite large. I read it over the course of a semester, and it's like an 800-ish, sort of page tome. And it's a really fascinating book because it's a book written essentially about the status of women. And Beauvoir was writing, around the middle point of the 20th century. So it was really interesting because while there had been the occasional feminist beforehand, for example, abolitionist feminists, as well as various suffrage movements, Olympe de Gouges, and so on. So they were feminists before Beauvoir. But Beauvoir's work, The Second Sex, really, I think, sharpened what feminism as a movement is really all about. Previous feminist movement tended to focus especially on the issue of equal opportunity, that women were excluded from various kinds of institutions, political institutions, educational institutions, civic institutions, economic institutions, and so on, and generally consigned to the domestic sphere. And so one, branch of feminism emerges to say that women, should essentially have those the opportunities that men have for those same positions. But Beauvoir is the introduction of another kind of feminism, one that doesn't really seek access to various kinds of institutions so much as to change or transform those institutions themselves. And in general, Beauvoir's account is going to be that women are defined in a certain way by their situation. So her book is all about the situation of womanhood. And this was, not something that was, a normal thing to investigate or to do at the time. But nevertheless, she did, using this existentialist framework that she developed in part with her longtime partner, Jean-Paul Sartre, who we read many weeks ago. to really try to clarify in a very systematic way the situation of women and the legitimate political demands that can be made on the part of women for, kind of feminist politics, feminist movement. And one thing to begin with is that Beauvoir isolates as really fundamental to her account of what the situation of womanhood is that womanhood is inherently an ambiguous concept. And what she means by that is that people use the word woman and they think that they mean one thing, but in reality, they mean like a whole bunch of different things. Right? So, in other words, one aspect of our account when we use the word woman, for example, is descriptive. We mean to say that women are defined perhaps by self-identification or by their chromosomes or by their genitals or by their capacity to engage in sexual reproduction and so on, right? We've had all of these various different conceptions of what womanhood entails. And this approach to womanhood, Beauvoir notes, is especially prominent in fields like medicine and sexology, where the interest in women oftentimes deals with issues surrounding sexual reproduction. So insofar as men are interested in women, exactly insofar as they can, for example, continue a lineage and contribute to a family line and so on, and birth an heir, then women are defined and understood primarily by their capacity for sexual reproduction. So Beauvoir summarizes the sort of attitude towards women that women are a womb, right? Women are like a thing, right? They're an object for men and for the use of men. And it's important to emphasize that this is not just like, overly emotional or something like that, right? We're talking about an era in which women, very often had to be legally represented by their father or their husband. Women are essentially traded between male heads of household for, a great many centuries in Western forms of life. And so the association between womanhood, femininity, and the capacity for birth or reproduction was really essential, right? This was essential to defining the situation of women for a very many number of centuries, right? But it's important to emphasize, and it's an important aspect, Beauvoir thinks, of the experience of being a woman, is that that's not all we mean when we say that someone is a woman, right? We also have a prescriptive valence to that word. So we have another sense where we start to think about women in a prescriptive way, right? And this is most obvious when we talk about real womanhood, right? Who's a real woman? So, is a woman who is infertile, for example, a real woman, if we conceive of womanhood as the capacity to engage with sexual reproduction? Do women lose their womanhood as they lose the capacity to engage in sexual reproduction, as they go through menopause and so on, right? And so part of the complexity of feminism in analyzing women's situation is that you have to realize that women, on the one hand, are told that they are like a thing, that they're limited by a sort of biological destiny that's associated with womanhood, right? And that's contained in the descriptive, nature of the account of womanhood that reduces women to mere objects. But then there's also this prescriptive account of womanhood where it's not enough simply to be the bearer of certain kinds of organs or certain kinds of capacities and so on, right? There are various norms or standards that we associate with what it means to really perform womanhood. So, is a woman who's not a housewife a real woman, right? Is a woman who, doesn't engage in sexual relationships with men, like lesbians, are they real women under this kind of definition, right? And so part of the issue with the idea of real womanhood is that it constantly fluctuates between the descriptive and the prescriptive definition. On the one hand, women are always limited, they're always reduced to an object, to like an inherent kind of destiny that's associated with their biology. But then, on the other hand, new demands are made of women all the time in order for them to really or adequately express their womanhood. So women, on Beauvoir's account, are in this constant sort of double bind situation, right? They're told that they are not enough, but ever more demands are made of women. And Beauvoir, as I mentioned, is an existentialist, right? And you can think, that existentialism is the antonym of essentialism. So in other words, existentialism means the opposite of essentialism. And in general, we philosophers understand essentialism concerning gender or sex to be the belief that there is in essence of what it means to be a woman that we can, correlate with having certain kinds of features, whether that's you produce certain kinds of gametes, or you have a kind of psychological self-identification, or, it's a sort of social role that you play in the world, so on, right? All of these say that there's something like in essence for what it means to be a woman. And so the existentialist account is going to say the opposite of that. In particular, this is probably the most famous phrase of Beauvoir's philosophy, that one is not born but becomes a woman, right? You have to not only fit the descriptive parameters, but you also have to live up to the prescriptive norms that are placed on women. And Beauvoir thinks that the fundamental norm about being a woman, the sort of most fundamental aspect of the woman's situation, is that you're told that your life is secondary to men. She substantiates this idea through appeal to a lot of figures in the philosophical tradition. For example, Aristotle thought that men were all active and that women were always just passive. Women were like inert matter. They were there to be shaped and sculpted by men, right? They needed men in order to form them, in order for them to take on, any kind of importance for Aristotle. For Aristotle, women are like incomplete men, right? And even though not necessarily every philosopher agrees with Aristotle's account in that way, most philosophers, almost all philosophers in the Western tradition, think about humanity and being a man as relatively interchangeable. So in other words, their image of the human being is always what they consider to be a full human being, a real human being, which is, of course, a man, right? So to continue with the quote, humanity is male, and man defines women not in herself, but relative to him. She is not regarded as an autonomous being. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. Now, this quote, I think, has been very, very helpful for feminists over the past decades in trying to define a term that's often sort of bandied about in our vocabulary, but very little defined, which is patriarchy. Patriarchy sometimes is defined as the rule by men or the rule by fathers or something like this. But Beauvoir, I think, would want to say that patriarchy describes societies in which women are consigned to the role of the other, that there's an essential secondariness to women's position, that women are presumed to be, in charge of the domestic sphere, and their husbands are in turn, the true citizens, right? They're heads of households. They are representatives of the family in both political and economic life. So Beauvoir thinks that to live in a genuinely free society means overcoming the condition of patriarchy, of creating a world in which women are not, by default, secondary to men. Now, the other reading I have us focusing on is something more contemporary, Leslie Feinberg. Now, Leslie Feinberg is one of my personal heroes. They were a trans novelist and political activist. Leslie Feinberg uses the pronouns sie, here, right? Modeled on German, gender-neutral pronouns. If you have trouble with neo-pronouns, right, they, them is, always appropriate to refer to anyone. So, feel free to use that. But Leslie Feinberg uses these pronouns because Z describes their experience as not being at home, being a man or a woman. So Feinberg describes being born as a woman, transitioning at some point to living as a man, but being dissatisfied with the idea of passing as a man and embracing here ambiguous gender identity. So Feinberg was talking about, what is now extremely controversial political stuff, really all around the world, all the way back when it was considered like an extremely fringe kind of issue, right? And Feinberg's central claim, as is contained in this second little section here, is that trans liberation has meaning for you, no matter how you define your sex or your gender. In other words, Leslie Feinberg says that trans liberation is a universal struggle. So there's often this sense, I think, in contemporary discussions about gender and sex that, to be concerned with trans issues is sort of like inherently partisan or provincial in some way, right? That trans issues are primarily interested to trans people, right? And oftentimes the claim is made, well, we don't want to, fragment our political solidarity, whatever. So, let's not focus on these controversial issues. Let's instead focus on, something that's more relevant to everyone, or something like that. But the central case that Leslie Feinberg tries to make in the short reading that I've given you is that everyone has an interest in transgender liberation. Leslie Feinberg describes the situation of not even being able to get medical care because doctors would not give her any kind of treatment, right, for life-endangering medical condition. And so, for trans people, the issue of trans liberation obviously has some heightened existential stakes, I think you could fairly say. But nevertheless, even if you don't share in that situation, even if you're, straight and you're perfectly happy in your gender, your sex, your sexuality, etc., Feinberg wants to claim that trans liberation has something to offer to you, something that's important to you, something that is genuinely worth fighting for. And the central idea is really this quote that I have here on our last little segment. Feinberg recounts that all your life you've heard such dogma about what it means to be a real woman or a real man. And chances are you choked on some of it. These ideas of what a real woman or man should be straitjacket the freedom of individual self-expression. So Feinberg's idea is this: none of us live up to, I don't know, perfect gender stereotypes, ideal masculinity, ideal femininity. And moreover, there's not even really like agreement about what these things are. And Feinberg makes the claim that most of us have some understanding of being policed by someone's conception of what it means to live up to being a real gender, right? Are you like a real man if, for example, you don't play sports, or you're not traditionally masculine, or if you're gay, for example, does this undermine your masculinity, right? These are claims made about what real masculinity or real femininity entails that are hurtful, not just to trans people, but to people that are cisgender, to people that feel perfectly happy within the gender identity that was given to them at birth. And in a way, it's undignified for someone to say that you act some way, right, because of your gender. You're the author of your behavior, and your gender is, in a way, a complex negotiation that you have with pre-established norms that precede you and will live on long after you. So, you know, with that being said, everyone is hurt by restrictive gendered norms regarding what it means to be a real man and what it means to be a real woman. These ideals are never really definable. They're always going to shift and change. And so consequently, they're always going to marginalize and exclude some group of people that are said to be out of touch with those kind of standards. If you have a standard and some measure of people live up to the standard, then inevitably there's going to be another class of people that don't. And so I think Beauvoir and Feinberg would conclude together that ideas about real masculinity and real femininity are often very hurtful. And political practices that discriminate on the basis of these are doubly hurtful. And so I think Beauvoir and Feinberg, in different ways, through a sort of feminist analysis and from the perspective of a trans activist, make a claim about the nature and the importance of gender freedom. I hope that you found this video interesting. I very much look forward to what you think, and I'll see you in the next video.